All right. So in this segment, we're going to start off by talking about how people in the adulthood period um, who are terminally ill, what they worry about, how they think about death, and what the big concern is. Right, with little children who were losing somebody, their big concern was about being abandoned. Terminally ill people who are in this age bracket of what should be vital adulthood, they're really concerned about two main things. One is about leaving things undone. Here's a quote from Pablo Picasso that says, "Only put off until tomorrow what you are willing to die having left undone." It's a really good reminder that life is uncertain. You never know if you're going to be able to come back and complete that project or say those loving words or whatever, right? So only put off until tomorrow those things that you're willing to die having left undone. That's a really common concern for full-fledged adults, right? 25 to 65. They oftentimes are in the midst of their most generative years where they are creating things, they're in charge of things, and they don't want to leave it. They don't want to leave things undone. Maybe they don't want to miss out on how sort of like the story ends. They might feel like, well, I want to see how the kids are going to grow up, or I want to see, this project I've been working on come to fruition. They're worried about those kinds of things. And then just like children are worried about being left alone, adults are oftentimes concerned that with their death, their family will suffer, right? They're going to leave their family alone, maybe without a breadwinner, or maybe, without, they don't want their sister to have to not have their sister anymore. These kinds of things. They're like people who are dying are oftentimes worried about what's going to be left behind. They oftentimes are less worried about what they're facing. They're not saying, well, I'm going into the unknown and I'm really scared of that. They tend to talk about missing out on the things that are the known, the things that are happening in the world. So really common, these two main fears are the most common ones. Now, in people who are over 65, we see, like I said, across the adult lifespan, we're seeing less and less death anxiety. So in the 65 and older, death anxiety continues to go down. It's kind of surprising to younger people to hear an older person talk about not being fearful of death, because it's kind of a really, hard to relate to perspective when you're a young person and you don't want to die and you're like, I want to do things to protect myself and live a long and healthy life. And to see somebody who is winding down and starting to think, well, you know what? It's getting to be my time. And it's kind of a little shocking for a younger person to see an older person talking like that, but they're not as scared of death as they get older. They have more hope about, what's coming next for them, more hope about the future for the world and their families and the people who are going to be left behind. They're less worried that if I'm not here, it's all going to fall apart. And so there's that change that's going on. Those people who display acceptance of morality, and we measure that through things like, have they written a will? Have they designated their healthcare proxies who can make a decision if they're incapable to make decisions? If they've gone through the process of trying to reconcile with their estranged family members, like maybe there were big fights in the past and I haven't talked to my sister in a long time, but I've reconciled and tried to make up, and actually it turns out I still don't like her, but I tried, right? Maybe they planned their funeral. These kinds of behaviors are evidence that the person has accepted their own mortality. Those things are associated with greater mental health. People who are delaying those things, who don't want to talk about those things, who always think they can handle it tomorrow, those are people who are more likely to display anxiety and depression symptoms. I told you previously that my father-in-law just died recently, and his funeral is coming up this weekend. And one thing I have to give him a lot of credit for, he was like my age, and he and his wife sat down back 30 years ago and wrote their first will. Part of why they did that, I think, is because they had a blended family and they wanted everything written down for sure, so that my father-in-law's 8 children and my stepmother-in-law's 3 children would know for sure how things were supposed to be dispersed and stuff if anything happened. And, they lived another 40 years after they wrote that will. But they knew that they had, they had stuff to be divided up, and they wanted the kids to not have to. And they actually planned for their own funerals. They took care of everything so that the kids don't have to worry about that stuff. And you know what? That probably helped to contribute to them living such a long life. They were mentally healthy. They were not fearful. They had everything taken care of, and they knew that everything was fine. And that's really a healthy approach, I have to say. Congratulations to my in-laws for that. Honestly, my parents did it too. So congratulations to that age group for having taken care of those things. Now, something that people like to talk about a lot is the possibility of a near-death experience. So the definition of a near-death experience is where a person has come close to dying, or they thought they came close to dying. It turns out it doesn't have to be a physical thing. You just have to strongly believe that you were likely to die. And you have an experience. You clearly don't die because you're able to come back and tell us what happened. So they come close to dying, or they believe that they came close to dying, and then they come back and they report really consistent things. They tend to report feeling like they left their mortal body, that their perception of themselves actually left the body. That there's often, almost every time that there's this bright white light that is so bright but doesn't hurt their eyes. Like really consistently they'll say, normally this is the kind of light that you would want to wear sunglasses, but it doesn't hurt your eyes. So moving towards this bright light that typically people will say they feel like is beckoning them. This white light it's really a strong bright white light, but it feels like peace. And so they're pulled toward it. They tend to report that they're feeling peacefulness. They tend to report that they felt joy during this time. They weren't scared. They were thinking, yay, this is what I wanted. I want to go into the light. A lot of times the reports will include different kinds of religious elements. Like some people will report that they thought they saw Jesus beckoning them toward them, these kinds of things. And the religious elements vary based on the person's culture, and if they have a religious background, typically these will be consistent with that religious background. So there are two main theories to explain what these people are reporting. The first one is what we call the dualist explanation. A dualist says that these near-death experiences prove that there is a heaven. That clearly when a person dies, they are beckoned into heaven by a religious figure, and it's nothing to be scared of. It's a joyful and peaceful transition, and this is just a person having gotten a glimpse of what's to come, and that your soul is going on up to heaven. The monists, on the other side, say these things that people are describing are symptoms of the brain shutting down. And they'll point to situations like in astronaut training, they'll put people into a centrifuge and spin them really hard until they pass out, basically, because all the blood leaves the brain and pools in the feet, and so the person will pass out. When they first wake up from having passed out, they will report almost exactly these near-death experiences. They'll say they saw a really bright light, that they felt, like when they wake up, oftentimes from having passed out, they will laugh and be like giddy about whatever they had just gone through, and they want to go through it again. They want to be spun again and pass out again. So there's this very similar set of descriptions. Now, the people who pass out from that don't usually report that they felt like they were leaving their body, and they don't usually report religious elements. So those are pretty significant differences, but the bright light and the peacefulness and joy might be attributable to blood leaving the brain or consciousness leaving the brain, so that the last thing that your occipital lobe detects, which is the back part of your brain that does vision, is just this narrowing of all the visual stimuli out in the world into this little pinpoint, and that's what causes the bright light sensation. And the reason why it doesn't hurt your eyes is because it's your brain making this interpretation. It's not your eyes. And so as everything else is shutting down, you've got just this last bit of bright light sensation in the back of the brain. And then with the peacefulness and joy, that's attributable to endorphins that are released during whatever illness or injury the person had, or the loss of blood to the brain that the astronauts experience. And so this big dose of endorphins are basically like heroin, right? Or being high on morphine or something. And so the person is experiencing this opioid effect rather than, legitimately going on to the next life or something. So this is a big debate. And the reason why it's a big debate is because, nobody really knows what happens after these experiences, right? Like these people who come back and report these experiences obviously made it through whatever the life-threatening situation was. And so we don't know what happens on the other side of that. In a certain way, it kind of doesn't matter what happens on the other side of that, because if the process of dying is full of peacefulness, joy, and a beckoning white light, it's probably at least valid to say that it's not that scary, right? That at the moment of the transition, that you're not scared, that you probably have all these, whether it's endorphins or it's because you're going up to heaven, one way or another, the process is probably not painful or scary. So when we talk about near-death experiences, it's a great sort of philosophical debate. Some people who have had these near-death experiences report that they were not religious prior to the experience, but then afterwards, now they are. Some people have reported negative near-death experiences where they believed that they went to hell. And they report having smelled sulfur and it was hot and that there were scary sounds and that they literally thought they had gone to hell. And they came back and they were like, okay, I'm turning my life around. I'm not going back there. Like they really believe that they caught a glimpse of hell. So whether it really is or not, heaven or hell, or if it's just a, monist interpretation is the correct one, it seems to be a profoundly life-altering thing that people experience when they have a near-death experience. One way or another, they are changed as a function of that experience. So I think it's worth talking about. There are a lot of books out there where people have had these experiences and they talk about how their lives changed. So it's a really interesting sort of in-between state, because obviously they came back to life. All right, let's talk a little bit about dying and acceptance. Most people hope that if they can have control over when their death occurs and stuff, that they'll have a good death. That's usually defined as, it being peaceful and quick and painless. Most people report that they would like that to occur after they've lived a good, long, healthy life. They want to be in the company of their family and friends. They don't want to be alone, usually people report, and they want to be in familiar surroundings. Most people would prefer not to die in the hospital or in some strange place. So these are descriptors that have come from lots of surveys of people and what you would consider to be a good death. And so this all comes together into like this pattern of what people are looking for in a good death. Now, a bad death is oftentimes described as, not having those elements of the good death. And then I wanted to add that, especially the elderly really dread that. The idea of being in the hospital away from their loved ones. I think that's one of the things that was so awful about the COVID pandemic, is that you had people being separated from their families and, hospitalized for weeks for some people, really invasive treatments, trying to clear their lungs and other things. And, to die alone like that, the medical staff would let them Zoom their friends and family or FaceTime them or whatever. But, it's not the same. And that's like, especially for elderly, that's the dreaded situation, to be alone, scared, and having all these treatments that aren't going to work anyway. And so that's what people typically will characterize as a bad death. So you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of death. I'm going to introduce them and then we'll talk about some of the criticisms afterwards. So what she argued is that we go through 5 stages of death, and she talked about them as being progressive. So the first stage is denial, where you're like, I'm not really dying. There's nothing really wrong with me. The test was wrong. Something like that, denial. Once you've gotten through the denial phase, then you move into the anger stage, she says, where now you're like, I can't believe that the doctors didn't pick this up earlier, or, that God didn't protect me from this, or, anger, where you're like, this isn't fair. This shouldn't be happening to me. Then there's the bargaining phase, where the person has gotten over their anger. Now they're like, okay, if you just get me through this, I'll be good from now on. I'll stop smoking, or I'll eat right, or, whatever. This bargaining that the person goes into next. Once the bargaining is over and the person realizes there's nothing that can be done, I'm going to die, they go into a depression and start to feel like nothing really matters anymore. What's the point of even trying? I don't want to do the treatments anymore. It's not going to work. And then ultimately there's acceptance, where the person finally gets to a place where they say, well, death is part of life. I'm just experiencing the final developmental stage and I'm ready to face it. So really important for Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages is this orderly progression, and that you sort of wrap up your denial, then move to anger, and then you wrap that up and then you move to bargaining. So she was very specific about, moving in that particular order. I'm going to turn on my screen microphone. All right. I'm going to have you watch this Homer Simpson going through the 5 stages as fast as humanly possible. He just found out he's going to die because he ate this puffer fish and he ate the part that will kill you.
You can expect to go through 5 stages. The first is denial.
No way, because I'm not dying.
Second is anger.
Why, you little...
After that comes fear.
What's after fear? What's after fear?
Bargaining.
Doc, you gotta get me out of this. I'll make it worth your while.
Finally, acceptance.
Well, we all gotta go sometime.
Mr. Simpson, your progress astounds me.
So what was that? 30 seconds. And he went through the whole 5 stages all in order. He accomplished them all and he ultimately was ready to face death, right? Well, that's really uncommon. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about some of the criticisms of Kubler-Ross's model and other ways to deal with death.